Welcome, everyone. My name is Zoe Colon. I am pleased to be with you today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Associate Director of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives at UCF and uh, proudly serve as a Senior Advisor to the Puerto Rico Research Hub. Our team has put together a slate of exciting Hispanic Heritage Month events for the entire month. We're actually halfway through, and I'm very pleased to welcome our guests, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Rivera, the Director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub.
Thank you, Zoe, and welcome everyone. We have a wonderful panel today talking about the demographic changes and all the things that are going on in terms of that. As you know, we're in this historical time where the U.S. Census does tell us sort of the growth of the Puerto Rican population, particularly in the state of Florida. But today we're going to talk a little bit more, and we're going to start sort of kind of like the historic aspect of it, that a lot of people don't know, right? That some of this population movements have been going on for a while. And that's we're so happy to have today Dr. Victor Vasquez Hernandez, and he's gonna talk to us a little bit about some of the findings from his book, Boricuas in the Magic City, Puerto Ricans in Miami, and then to make sense of that growth more recently. Some of the things that Dr. Michael Rodriguez is sort of looking in his book on the figures of the future, right? And what does that mean, right? What has been the discussion? So we'll have sort of a fascinating discussion on what does this mean, and what has been some of the research involved in this, and what is the discussion surrounding all these issues out here. And we look forward to the discussion, and we look forward to your answers as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Victor Vasquez Hernandez. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. Victor, I think you're muted. There we go.
Okay, I'm good. Am I good now? Gracias, buenas tardes, saludos everyone. I am thrilled to be participating in an event for the first time with the University of Central Florida and the Puerto Rican Hub. And, thank you, Fernando, for your work and your leadership. Congratulations to you and University of Central Florida for establishing the Puerto Rican Hub. To Zoe Colon, who put together this fabulous month of events and this panel. Thank you for doing all that great work. A couple of things I'm going to be talking about a little bit, make sure that we have time for conversation, and thank you all to the folks who have joined us in this conversation. As you know, census took place last year. I have certain reservations about it, but anyway, it was done, and the data has been dripping in. And so for Florida, this is a very important time, particularly in the political sphere, where it looks like the state's going to gain one congressional seat. So there are going to be a lot of issues around that. And of course, the census data is going to be key for determining where that district is going to be and so forth. If we believe the suggestions of the census data as it's been presented over the last couple of months, the argument seems to be that the Puerto Rican population, while it grew at a slower pace. At least one journalist referred to it as a plateau. So it's about the numbers of Puerto Ricans in Florida now are about 1.2 million, give or take. The issue that I have is possibly with the sampling here, but let's use that number for argument's sake, that Puerto Ricans are 1.2 million residents in the state. Of course, they are in all 67 counties, but the hubs seem to continue to be Central Florida as the main hub, and a very significant number, second place, South Florida. What has surprised me about the numbers that I've looked at is And just so you know, as a historian, I use census data a lot. I do especially study early Puerto Rican presence in the diaspora. And so I use manuscript census. For those of you who are not familiar, the manuscript census is that part of the census that includes a lot of the personal data that's collected. And for legal purposes, that information is not released for 72 years. So if you're counting, that information for the 2020 census will be released near the end of this century. And that'll be for other researchers to look at. But I've used that data to provide a snapshot of who these individuals have been and so forth and so on. And over the course of the last 15, 20 years, my work has been about Puerto Ricans in the diaspora in Philadelphia and Florida. And regarding the Puerto Ricans in Florida, I have written 2 articles that have been published by journals here in Florida, where I indicate that in terms of historical perspectives, the first Puerto Rican settlement in Florida was in Tampa, in the area of Ybor City. And I've traced that development over the course of the 20th and 21st century in what I call the Boricua Triangle, kind of a spin-off on the Bermuda Triangle, hopefully without the disastrous effects of it. But I call it the Boricua Triangle, Tampa, Miami, and Orlando, as sort of the 3 hub cities. And if you look at the map of Florida and you draw that triangle with those 3 cities, about 80% of the Puerto Rican population lives within and around that triangle in terms of numbers. And I have tried to trace those movements, those migratory movements. Of course, Tampa and Ybor City, the biggest attraction at the end of the 19th and early 20th century was tobacco and cigar making in particular, and a lot of other industries related, and union organizing, and this in a segregated city, right? So the issues of race in terms of the Puerto Rican population in the middle of this, these segregated areas is of particular interest to me and developing. What happens around 1940 is that the trend begins to shift, in part because of the decline of the cigar industry in Tampa with the use of the cigar making machine. And so people start moving from Tampa to New York and other places. Tampa still attracts Puerto Ricans, but the numbers do not grow until later on into the 1970s. And the shift of Puerto Ricans moving to Florida moves to Miami. And one of the key elements of that contributed to that migration was the fact that in 1929, Pan American Airways began direct flights between San Juan and Miami. Now, of course, they were a little expensive, but it opened the way for travel to Miami. And so the numbers of Puerto Ricans begin to develop, I would say starting in the 1920s, but certainly by World War II, because of Miami's place in training troops. Lots of Puerto Ricans came here for that training. And then post World War II, along with the other great migration that went to mostly to New York and other places in the Northeast and the Midwest, the numbers of Puerto Ricans begins to grow. And then, as you all know, those of you who live in Central Florida, in the 1960s, with a certain, with the Disney and all that happening, the space industry, there's a third shift, a wave of Puerto Ricans to Florida, towards the Central Florida area. Now, what I have found interesting about these shifts is what are the similarities with other cities like New York and Philadelphia? Obviously, large numbers of working class folks coming to Florida. But in the course of the last 3 decades, and of course, in the course of the development and expansion of the numbers of Puerto Ricans getting college degrees on the island, there's a reflection of that kind of training and professional levels of Puerto Ricans that have migrated to all of Florida, but to Central Florida and to South Florida. There is one thing I will mention, and I don't want to take too much time in this, but it's one particular wave of Puerto Ricans that arrived in the 1940s that distinguished them from the rest of the Puerto Rican population was a dozen or so Puerto Rican industrialists who left the island in the early 1940s, which is when the first popular democratic government was instituted on the island. And a lot of these investors, including the Ferres and the Roigs and other well-known individuals, were afraid of the Partido Popular Democrático's socialistic bent and brought their capital to Miami and developed and invested in a lot of different businesses here. But over the course of that, the biggest draw for Miami during the 1950s was the garment industry, and then of course tourism. And so I was talking the other night at a reception to a woman that was born in Miami in the early 1960s, and her father came from the island, started working for the hotels in Miami Beach, and ended up as a chef in the hotel. So opportunities and promotions. And then, of course, in the course of my work for this book, and I should say that I am currently working on a manuscript on the history of the Puerto Rican population, on the Puerto Ricans in Florida. So all of this work I've been doing has been towards that. And so at some point, Dr. Rivera, I'm heading up to Orlando to meet with you and to look at UCF and other resources as I put this book together. But I have found some really interesting aspects. The book that I put together, it's really a photographic book, and this is done by Arcadia Publishing. You all may be familiar with its Images of America series. And they're fairly short books, usually about 200 photographs with captions and chapter intros, which tells the story of a particular community. In this case, Miami. In the case of Chicago, they published one. New York, they published two. Philadelphia has one as well. And it's really a story of the presence of the Puerto Ricans from organizations to business individuals and politics and so forth. And so some of you know that in terms of the politics, that the first Hispanic mayor in Florida was in Miami in 1972. Maurice Ferre was elected mayor of the city of Miami. He was the son of one of these industrialists, Jose Ferre, that moved his family here in the 1930s. And of course, he was Puerto Rican, and he served for 12 years. And there have been no non-Latino mayors in the city of Miami since then. In fact, since Ferre, they've all been Cubans. But this was a man who opened up opportunities for folks here. The book also reflects the politics of the 1950s when, because of the growth of the Puerto Rican population in Miami, and just 40 miles south of Miami is the city of Homestead, and it's the farmland of South Florida. Many farm workers began coming here with and without contracts, and there was a lot of abuse. And the Puerto Ricans in the community at that time decided to organize the Puerto Rican Democratic Club, because Miami was a democratic city then, to address the issues of these farm workers, and of course to establish the Puerto Rican hub in Miami, which was the community of Wynwood, which has been transformed over the last 80 years. But that was the home and the hub of the Puerto Rican presence here. Now, one last thing I want to mention about population, because I also want to make sure that Dr. Rodriguez can chime in the conversation, and then we can have questions and have further discussion, is that the numbers, and this is kind of circular back to the where I started talking about the census, indicates that the population in South Florida, when I say South Florida, I'm talking about Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties, has increased, but the numbers seem to suggest a diversity of increase. And it doesn't quite jive with the numbers that I've been following for the last 10 years through the American Community Surveys. And this might be, as an article that you were cited on, Fernando, also cited Dr. Luis Martinez of UCF, it may be a problem of sampling. But just to give you an example, that according to the numbers that I looked at in the surveys that I looked at in 2016 and 2018, the Miami-Dade numbers, and it might be a little high on my end, but it was about 130,000 Puerto Ricans in Miami-Dade County. And we're talking about a county that has almost 2 million people. The census sample indicates that it's 98,436 plus or minus 9-point difference there. So I do take a little bit of issues with that. But if we take those numbers, just for argument's sake, there are probably somewhere between 260,000 to 300,000 Puerto Ricans in South Florida. So that makes us the second largest region, if you will, if we take their numbers of 385,000 Puerto Ricans in the 4-county area, Osceola, Orange, and so forth. That's a lot of folks, right? Even if they're dispersed, we have a state that's large and has 14, 15 million people. But in terms of politics, you mentioned that I congratulated me on being elected city councilman in Miami Springs, a small city. If you're familiar at all with the airport of Miami, we are just north of the airport. And so, but I'm the only Puerto Rican elected official in Miami-Dade County. We've had other elected officials. We had Ferre as mayor, and then county commissioners and so forth. State Representative Robert Asensio. In fact, Robert Asensio was the first, when he was elected in 2016, was the first Puerto Rican elected state representative elected since Maurice Ferre had been a state representative in 1967. So we do have a couple of elected officials in Palm Beach and in Broward County, but given the numbers, we have a lot to do to continue, contrary and looking at the work that you all been doing in Central Florida, where you have an elected congressman and state senators and representatives and commissioners and so forth. I congratulate you, and I envy you guys in that, but that's still a lot more to do. So just finally, I think that the numbers are important, but they should be taken with a grain of salt. They're important because they're going to be used for redistricting, whether we like it or not. Those numbers are going to be there. And I've been in redistricting fights in 1991 and 2001 in Pennsylvania, so I know what those fights are like. But it's important to do those. But you got to take them with a little bit grain of salt. But for educational purposes and for studying the demographics and the anthropological and sociological side of me, there's a wonderful area of study here. I use interviews and other data to match it up with the population data and newspapers accounts and so forth to try to give a better account and story here. So I am going to leave it there. My book, Boricuas in the Magic City, it's on Amazon, as are my other books as well. And I'm looking forward to getting and reading Dr. Rodriguez's book. I'm always looking at the literature that other of my colleagues produce around the country, particularly when it has to do with the Puerto Rican diaspora, even if it's not specifically about the Puerto Rican diaspora, but rather, Latinos, Puerto Ricans, and relationship with other Latinos. So thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you for that great overview, particularly of the history of the population and the Puerto Rican population here in the state of Florida. And I think this ties, gets the baseline, to more of a national level and more of the ethnographic and qualitative work that Dr. Michael Rodriguez Muñiz is doing at Northwestern. So Michael, if you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your work, and share a little bit of what you've been working on in this last couple of years.
Assuming everyone can hear me, is that?
Yes.
Hear me? Wonderful.
We can hear you.
Terrific. Thank you, Fernando. And congratulations, Dr. Vasquez, on your latest book. Before getting into my work, I just want to thank Zoe Colon, as well as the Puerto Rican Hub and the Alianza Center for organizing the event. I think Marcos Vilar is on the Zoom. I just want to sort of acknowledge him. I've known Marcos since he was a teacher at Roberto Clemente High School in Humboldt Park, Chicago. So that's where I'm zooming from, Humboldt Park, Chicago. Where the conversation about demographic growth of Puerto Ricans in Central Florida tends to be one of growth, maybe plateauing. As Dr. Vasquez mentioned, the one in Chicago is unfortunately one of decline for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to give some impressions about, but I don't study that in my own work. I recently published a book called Figures of the Future, Latino Civil Rights and the Politics of Demographic Change, just published by Princeton Press. This book began as a dissertation research, and in fact, the field work for this really took place here, here in Orlando, Central Florida, prior to the 2012 election. And I'm especially grateful not only because of the opportunity to sort of kick off the field work. There's a chapter specifically about the 2012 election, sort of toggling between some of the sort of local voter work that was happening, as well as sort of the national conversation around the Latino population and electorate. But I also want to just acknowledge just being embraced by a number of folks in the community here. As a Puerto Rican raised in Chicago, I had always been super interested in Orlando and Central Florida's Puerto Rican community. And so, just to acknowledge folks, leaders like Zoraida Rios Andino and the late and great Pico Ricard, who, kind of opened, their homes and just, took me under their wing as I spent time in Central Florida. So sort of thinking about share a bit about the book, and I'm also looking forward to just the conversation, questions, and all of that. I just want to say just a few things kind of like to set up what I think the book attempts to do. And in that way, for me, it's a shift in two ways from the preceding presentation, from a kind of local, regional discussion to one that's national, but also a shift from talking about demography to what I call in the book population politics, a term that I'll come back to. So I'm not a demographer. I'm trained as a sociologist. And as I think my comments will make clear, I relate to demography with the questions around how we come to perceive demographic trends and projected demographic futures as individuals, as communities, and as societies. With that said, obviously the conversation around demographics, demographic change, whether local or national, this is a very timely moment to do so, given that, as folks know, the census data from the 2020 census came out, and that has sort of reanimated or re-energized the conversation around demographic trends, specifically ethnic racial trends in particular. So if folks have probably already heard, for instance, the 2020 census, the data from the census states that now the population counted The Latino population is over 62 million. In 2010, that number was over 50 million. And so that's a rate of growth of about 23%. There's a lot of really interesting conversations and discussions around racial identification that maybe people want to talk about. With, for instance, the number of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, however label we use, claiming a kind of racial identity as white, like alone, is now 20%, is just 20%, when a decade back it was 53%. So there's a whole lot of interesting stuff in the census data. And as Dr. Vasquez rightfully suggested to us, it's important to take data with a grain of salt, for sure. So how does this relate to my work? So one of the central questions for me is like, what does all this mean? Like, what does this data mean? Not from just a policy perspective, not from a scholarly perspective, but what does this mean to everyday folks, to political movements, to political actors? What does this mean, right? So even in, actually, let me switch slides here. So this is from the Pew Research Center. Just a basic graph, the US Hispanic population, the figure that I mentioned of 62 million. So it tracks population growth of this population from 1970 to 2020. And so a question that I'm curious, and maybe we can, when we get into the conversation, I'm curious what people think and feel about these figures. So what does that make you think? Does that make you hopeful? Does it make you excited? Does it make you anxious? Are you ambivalent? Are you indifferent? And for me, it's important to consider those different emotional responses to these data, and to these projections and things like that, whether speaking specifically about Puerto Ricans in Central Florida or Florida as a whole, or Mexican Americans in the Southwest, or the kind of like national profile of the Latinx population or Latino population. How do we interpret that? And the emotion that we kind of bring to that, it tells us something about that interpretation. So I want to just sit with a couple images. This will be the last slide that I have. And so these are two sort of graphics, two visual representations that both are underpinned by certain kinds of assumptions about demographics. So on the left-hand side for me, you have a cartoon, says Latino voters. This is an example of the very common phrasing of the sleeping giant, right? Here's this strong, muscular Latino voter. But unfortunately, that person, that collectivity that person represents is sleeping, right? And you see the parties. The parties are trying to figure out what to do with them, either making fun of them or trying to wake them up. But at the core of it, we have an idea of demographics. Here's this large population growing, but unfortunately, from the perspective of this cartoon, can't wake up in order to realize the parent's strength, right? The other image has a different orientation. This is an old meme, I guess, or old meme graphic that's been in circulation for maybe 10 to 15 years or more among white supremacist nativist groups, right? And so you see sort of images of, this is the narrative, the Reconquista, which anthropologist Leo Chavez has explored, you can see in red, this is sort of the takeover, or the retaking over of the Southwest. And even though it uses Aztlan and pyramids, you can see in I don't know if you're able to see more closely, it uses the language of Latinos. And so you see Florida is pretty red. That's not predominantly Chicano or Mexican, just like, let's say, New York, right? So this is communicating a different interpretation of some of the same data, right? There's a large population, but it's a threatening population. So what it's going to do is damage the country, destroy the country. And this is an old conversation. So keeping those images in play, there's a lot that we could say even more about these images, but one important thing that I think it says is that data only matters through how it's framed and subsequently how it's interpreted, right? So if the Census Bureau produces a bunch of data and it keeps all of that data in the Census Bureau and that data doesn't circulate and it doesn't get picked up and it doesn't get narrated, it doesn't get used, then it's not going to have any effect. Its meaning, its potential, its potency rests on that. And what's interesting here is we tend to talk about data as transparent, right? So we'll look at those figures from a couple slides back, and we talk of it as almost like it's transparent. You know, this is what's out there. And that's why we often talk about the census as a kind of mirror. We say, let the data speak. We hear those kinds of phrases. When in fact, the data sort of on its own can't really tell us much without this additional interpretive work. And so often that discussion of the data being transparent betrays, you know, that is in fact that we need to make that data speak and to be and we need to give that data a voice. And so that raises a question, in fact, of how, like, what are the ways that we want to talk about demographic change or population shifts, right? And what agendas do we advance by particular ways of narrating those demographic trends? And so that gets to the core of my book. My book is interested in the politics around the political struggles to shape how the public, how particular populations, communities, constituencies imagine demographic futures, right? And so that isn't, the data itself does not provide that story, right? That story is provided by political projects. You know, the media plays, of course, an important role, and other dominant institutions, scholars play an important role. Conversations like this and others play an important role in cultivating and shaping how we relate, think about, and feel about these demographic trends, right? And so specifically, I studied national Latino civil rights organizations, coalitions like the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, you know, sort of longstanding civil rights groups like the National Council of La Raza, Unidos US, which used to be the National Council of La Raza, and others. And I basically track between the 2010 census and the first 2 or 3 years of the Trump administration, the various kinds of ways that these organizations have leveraged, mobilized, and tried to capitalize on demographic numbers and narratives. And similar to the images, the image that we have up here of this Latino population as passive, not politically involved, not seizing its power, punching below its weight that we often hear talked about in relation to voting, and this kind of threat narrative, this demographic fear or this demographic problem that this population represents, these organizations are attempting to sort of contest both of those representations, presenting often, you know, rather utopian ideas about what population growth means, what the significance of the Latino population is. And so the book looks across various sorts of episodes from, as I mentioned, the 2012 election, the 2010 census prior to that. It also talks about advocacy around immigration reform after the 2012 election, and also responses to the kind of Trump project. And key here is understanding that the ideas that we have about Latino population growth, the emphasis on growth, the emphasis on talking about futures, is one that has a very long history. And so these population politics, as I talk about them in the US context, have been foundational, historically used by white supremacist groups to mobilize fear and anxiety of others. And we can go as far back as Ben Franklin worrying about how Germans were taking over white people, which for him were just Anglo-Saxons, to the kind of rhetoric and discourses that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to immigration policies in the early 20th century. And then, of course, since the 1970s, a focus on the border, Latin American immigrants, Mexican immigrants in particular. But the story that it tells in this particular book is how these populations who have been framed as a threat, as a problem to the US, have also developed their own ideas about what the future might mean and have attempted to organize and to try to build political power, leveraging certain ideas about what the future might hold. And so that's what I explore in the context, in the book, Figures of the Future. I'm happy to talk about other things. That was just kind of an overview, but the key thing is to kind of shift our register from, as in a lot of the public discourse, taking populations for granted, and also having these conversations about future trends as almost inevitable, and failing to really appreciate the historical and contemporary work that movements and political groups across ideological perspectives to influence and impose how we might think about and feel about these demographic trends. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the conversation.
So thank you so much for that overview, which brings about, all the layers of complexity into the discussion, right? That we think, and I think, lately it's been kind of like this idea, and obviously after Hurricane Maria, for me, that was kind of like a reintroduction of the Puerto Rican population in Central Florida. Talk about kind of like the figures and all sort of stuff, fully knowing that it was happening, but a lot of people were not perceiving those ideas. So I don't know, Victor, Michael, did you want to comment on, in terms of, because now I'm getting a sense of, how people reacting to what does that mean, right? In terms of that, especially, there's been some discussion about Hispanic Heritage Month, about celebrating Puerto Rican culture and achievements and all sorts of things. But at the same time, when you look historically, there's complications out here. I don't want you to kind of like look into a crystal ball, but what are you seeing some of the patterns out here, particularly in Florida, but also nationwide as well? Just to start the conversation, and we'll open the floor for questions soon enough. But kind of like that discussion, starting the discussion out here.
Well, I just like to chime in that numbers doesn't automatically mean you made it, right? So that, hey, we celebrate, we're 1 million strong in Florida. I remember when I was at Temple University in the 90s and early 2000s, my friends and other Latinos were saying, oh, in this census, we're going to be a larger number than African Americans. And I said, and I reminded them of the history of African Americans in the US. And I said, this is, you want to be, face all of those things that those folks have faced. So it's not a panacea. And of course, I was very intrigued by particularly the census responses in Puerto Rico, and how more Puerto Ricans identified themselves as multiracial or Afro-Boricuas, which had not been the case before. And so I think that's, it's important to take note of that. And also how you use this data locally, right? Because politics and the struggle for politics, and I spent 25 years with the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, organization no longer exists, but it existed for almost 30 years, trying to use those issues. Chicago was a big, an important battleground for that, the inclusion of Puerto Ricans and other Latinos in the civil rights agenda, right? Which is always a challenge, and took a lot of work, particularly in cities like Philadelphia, to get recognition, and to reach some kind of parity, which, by the way, still continue to this day. The image that you showed, Michael, about the map reminded me that when I used to teach a course on history of Latinos in the U.S. at Temple University, from 1848 to the present, I used to begin one discussion around the treaty that ended the Mexican War in 1848. And I would say something like, Mexicans went to bed the night before the treaty in Mexico, and they woke up the next day and they were in the United States. They never crossed the border. The border crossed them. And that kind of image of how we think about the border, which really means borderlands, doesn't really catch up to the discourse around immigration that I think is important.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I just want to co-sign the point about, demography doesn't equal power. You can use historical examples of South Africa and the apartheid system and things, but it's attempting. There's a lot of temptation to overestimate the political impact of demographic trends. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't play a role or the data isn't useful or meaningful in ways that we would want. It's more a question of sort of encouraging all of us to sort of reflect on the kind of investments, meanings, expectations we have vis-a-vis reported demographic trends. In the case of Puerto Rico, I think it's not something that, for instance, I talk about in the book, but there's currently a considerably strong demographic conversation happening in Puerto Rico in relation to demographic decline. And so, I think it's an important thing to sort of think about how and in what ways are ideas of demographic decline being mobilized in Puerto Rico to advance and to advance what kinds of political projects. But certainly, from a kind of like a straightforward demographic perspective, right? We see Puerto Rico's population right now kind of resembles what the population looked like in the 1980s. We've seen a pretty strong exodus. According to the Census Bureau, I believe somewhere about close to 12%, population fell about 12% over the past decade. If Puerto Rico was a state, that would be by far the most demographic loss of any state. And that demographic loss tends to be concentrated or sort of more extensive in the southern parts of the island. As part of the discourses around decline, there's this sort of sense of an emptying island. And I would point folks to, I think, an insightful essay from published in the Hemispheric Institute by Francis Negron Montanier, who argues that this emptying island is at once a trope, a threat, and a logic, and I'm quoting here, foundational, recurrent, and coterminous with the island's three distinct forms of colonial capitalist extraction, plantation, industrial, neoliberal, from the 15th century to the present. That piece for me kind of invites some reflection about the histories of this kind of conversation about decline and the various sorts of ways that decline now is being narrated for perhaps various sorts of ends.
If I may, Fernando, I think Dr. Rodriguez just hit on a very important intersectionality here. of demographics, economic development, business, so forth. Preparing for today, I know some folks that are doing some research, but I can't refer to it right now, but I can tell you that something I found striking about what they're doing is that there are, on the low side, about 500 corporations and businesses, maybe as many as 1,000 in Florida with Puerto Rico zip codes. And that means that businesses are here, but they are registered, they are Puerto Rican businesses, they're registered in Florida doing business. And I wanted to just mention that the intersectionality, not only of demographics, but of economic power and political power, right? And when we look at some of the communities around the country, we've had some significant gains when we've had the intersection of a strong business community and a strong civil rights community. And that's happened. I saw that very clearly in Philadelphia. The Asociación de Bodegueros Dominicanos were a force to be reckoned with. And they pushed their way into the political arena because they had made that commitment, that social economic commitment to using their power as bodegueros, right? And as building that kind of wealth to impact the economic arena. And so you asked us earlier, we had a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's impressive that we have that kind of business presence in Florida, that if we can harness it with an agenda that includes, civil rights and other things of that nature, we might make a significant impact.
No, so, and to that point and what we've been discussing, I think it's sort of that image of a sleeping giant, right? And it seems that rhetoric has been going on for probably the last 4 election cycles, right? So, what does that really mean in terms of that? It seems that damn if you do and damn if you don't. If it doesn't the way you envision it was going to happen, you get some type of backlash, right? And we've seen this throughout the different local elections, national elections, right? So you get kind of like this rhetoric, oh, this person got elected because they had the Latino vote, or oh, the Latinos didn't show up, so they didn't get elected, right? And so there's a lot of meaning and symbolism attached to that as well. So if you can comment a little bit of that, Michael, your work, and Victor, what you've seen as well.
Yeah, I mean, so, the rhetoric, you're absolutely right. It's been around for a few decades at least. There's even some traces of in the Southwest. Before it was a Latino sleeping giant, it was like a Mexican sleeping giant, in the 60s and 70s and stuff. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it continues it survives. Every election, you hear right before the election, the sleeping giant's going to wake up. Then after the election, maybe you'll hear the sleeping giant woke up. And then a little bit later, you'll hear the sleeping giant's still asleep. And the whole thing is like cyclical at least every national election. Though, of course, there's, ways that it manifests local elections and in local contexts. One of the things that's, I think, particularly, there's a lot to sort of unpack and criticize about the phrasing. People tend to sort of emphasize, frames Latinos as passive, as not politically engaged, reduces Latino and Latina sort of politics to elections, and then erases other forms of sort of political action. It's a stereotype, this, that, and the other. It sort of is connected to an older discourse of like the lazy Latino and all of that. But one of the things, in addition to all of that, that I think we don't spend enough time sort of criticizing it, is the way that it places the burden on Latinx, Latino, Hispanic voters for turning out or not turning out, as opposed to the structural conditions, the lack of investment and infrastructure that really is the culprit here. So it instead of having us understand the socio-political economic context in which voting takes place or doesn't take place, it places all of the burden, shame on the population. And I think that's one of the most sort of harmful things that we continue to see, given that the majority of the Latino population nationally is not in swing states. You know, Florida gets a lot more attention because it's a swing state. But for, let's say, all of the Latino, Latinas, Latinx, Hispanic folks in California, you know, people aren't checking for them. You know, no one's making investments, and the parties are not, they don't care about long-term electoral empowerment. So there isn't investments there. Many Latino organizations, they don't get the resources. Other groups get the resources to do voter registration. But at the end of the election, as Fernando mentions, folks are blamed. The population is blamed, despite there being structural reasons for why voting doesn't happen. So it's a harmful sort of discourse on a lot of fronts, including that one.
You know, that you reminded me, Dr. Rodriguez, when I was a young, about blaming folks, right? When I was a young activist at Ostos Community College a million years ago, I was, you know, learning about, you know, what it was to be, you know, feminism and what it was to be a feminist, right, as a man. And I read a book by a woman named Sheila Robertson called Women's Consciousness, Man's World. She used to talk about, you have to listen to the silence. In other words, you have to, what is it that people are saying by not saying? What is it that people are saying by not participating in the electoral process? What is it about that process? You mentioned the structural issues. What is it that people are not getting? And you know, as someone who spent a lot of time in politics, I could tell you that most folks that I come across, not just Puerto Ricans, but for Puerto Ricans in particular, they don't see themselves in the candidates. They don't see themselves, their lives reflected in the candidates, whether it's the appearance or the narrative or whatever. You know, what's the message? I have found, you know, using the case of the Dominicans in Philadelphia, people say, they're not citizens, they don't vote. Well, there are a lot of Dominicans that do vote. And they elected the first state representative, Dominicano, born and raised in Philadelphia, you know, about 8 years ago, because they had that candidate, Danilo Burgos, who was from them, had been a business owner, you know, went to the local public high schools. And I, you know, the parties, they don't care about that. They don't listen to that. People kept telling me, oh, Donald Trump won all this Puerto Rican vote. I said, yeah, well, you have people like Libre out there, right? And their plan was not that Democrats get the Puerto Rican vote in Central Florida. They have figured out that if they could get a little percentage of that Puerto Rican vote in Central Florida, they could deny the Democrats. And they did that in South Florida as well. So it was about politicking, but they used it to their advantage. But I think that, you know, there's a lot of work still to be done, right? At the local levels, and all politics is local. And we also need to get that business community more robustly involved in supporting Puerto Rican candidates in particular. I think we need to have more Puerto Ricans serving in Congress, no matter what, where they come from, because they're an important voice there, and as well as in the local levels. So, you know, I'm always encouraged. I kind of been an optimist all my life. I'm encouraged by it. I just don't have the same level of energy and strength to do all the groundwork that needs to be done. But I'm still at it. I'm still in the fight.
And I'm gonna ask Marcos Vilar, which is, you know, responsible for this event. If he could say a few words, if you're around, Marcos, if you want to say some words.
Yes, I am trying to get the video on, but it won't go on. But first of all, I want to say thank you, Dr. Rivera and Zoe and the University of Central Florida for putting this awesome event together. It's an honor for me to be part of this and be able to collaborate with you as president of Alianza Center. It's even more of an honor to be in this company with Dr. Vasquez and Dr. Rodriguez for a real personal reason, because as I was coming up as an activist and young teacher in the city of Chicago, often traveled to Philadelphia and New York for big gatherings of the Puerto Rican diaspora. And one of the ever-present figures in all of these meetings of the Puerto Rican diaspora was Dr. Vasquez, then professor of the University of Temple, or Temple University. And then also having had the privilege of knowing Dr. Rodriguez in his youth as he was studying at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and being an activist as well in the community of Humboldt Park. So for me, it's a very personal honor to be sharing this opportunity and being able to sponsor this event with UCF as Alianza Center. I want to touch on something that both of them mentioned. It seems to be sort of like a common thread in the presentation, is that demographics don't necessarily translate into power. And for many years, folks have been looking at Orlando and asking the question, how is it that Orlando has such a large Puerto Rican population and such a large Latino population, and we can't get Latinos elected to office? And I think that you've touched on some things here that are very relevant, the question of whether we see ourselves in the candidates, but there's also the question of the economics of running for office in the American democracy, right? In order to run for office, you need to have a war chest of resources to be able to, cost the expenses of getting your name out there. And while Alianza Center is a 501c3 organization that does not dabble in politics directly, we comment and participate in leadership development and a bunch of other things that lead to political empowerment. But we also, I also happen to work with APAC, and I wanted to share that it has been our experience that when you do identify capable candidates like Dr. Vasquez in the city of Miami Springs, when you identify candidates like Maribel Cordero, Joanna Lopez, who ran for school board, and Maribel for county commission, you can transform a city and it can happen. But you need to add to the knowledge, to the study, to the resources, the action. And so we have gone through a transformation in the last 6 years since the last census here in Central Florida, where at the start of the past century, you might have had maybe a handful of elected officials that were Puerto Rican, and the majority of those Republican. At that point, it was the Cubans from Miami that were supporting Latinos to run for office here in Central Florida. With the entrance of some of the projects that Michael mentions in his book, like Mi Familia Vota, Florida New Majority, and now Alianza, we have been able to turn that around and really get to the point where today we have approximately 30 Puerto Rican elected officials across the state of Florida, most of them concentrated here in Central Florida. But it has been gradual, but it has been a boom, and it has been a boom because we have been able to attract resources to put behind those candidates, good candidates, and even places like, and the impact is, for example, just 4 years ago, a little bit over 4 years ago, the County Commission of Orange County was a Republican commission, majority white. Today, it's a Democratic commission, all women, except for the mayor, who is African American, and only one person of Anglo descent. All the others, there's a Haitian African American woman, and there's 3 Latinas and two Anglo women on the board. But it's amazing the transformation that that county has gone through, and similarly in Osceola County as well. Although in Osceola County, we haven't seen the demographic. Interesting, because Osceola is the highest concentration of Hispanics. We've seen the political change of that commission, but not the demographic change in that commission. So very interesting stuff. And I really appreciate both of your presentations. Fascinating. It's an honor for us to be part of this panel and be able to, be part of making this this presentation possible. Thank you, both of you. And thank you also to UCF, Dr. Rivera.
Thank you, Marcos. I don't know, Victor or Michael, do you want to react to what Marcos stated? Before we have a couple of comments out here to react as well. So don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to just, I had mentioned Marcos, but when I came to Central Florida, Marcos at the time was working with Mi Familia Vota. And actually in the 4th chapter, there's a scene where I use pseudonyms, but it'll be obvious who I think Marcos is probably in the scene, but really helped connect me to folks in Orlando, which was, vital. If you ever done research, if you have no context, you have no research, you have no study. And so I really appreciate that. I think the examples that Marcos gave of the work that they're doing and have done and work that folks are doing elsewhere is ultimately like the question, right? It's a question about organizing. It's about building capacity, about creating movements. It's not about the demographics, it's about that everyday work, investment. That's how you sort of bring about change, as Marcos sort of is telling us and giving us those important examples. And so I think that's exactly right. The problem is, I think, where we assume or presume that there's something about these demographics that is going to like flip the switch, but that doesn't happen. It's actually people working, organizing, again, building collective capacity, influence, and power, mobilizing that does that, not just, some sort of latent demographics out there. And it's only thanks to all of that work. And one of the crazy things I think is that in this demographic conversation, we tend to look at certain places where we've seen some achievements and the like, and then we attribute it to demography rather than political organizing. So the conversation, for instance, around how California has changed, that story tends to be Latinos are numerous and that's how they like transform California. And it's like, well, it was also, organizations, unions, organizers, activists, parent groups, all kinds of sort of coalitions that sort of changed, to the extent that things have changed. It's really that rather than the demographic trends. That's not like the silver bullet.
Yeah, picking up on that point of coalitions, I saw a comment by Teresa, and I did not mean to suggest that Puerto Ricans only react to a Puerto Rican candidate, but I mean candidates can touch people in different ways, and the coalition building has been very instrumental. I'm almost sure Marco could speak to this. The building of coalitions is what's helped transform that commission into a majority women commission, majority women of color commission, to make difference in the kind of policies that they do. If it wasn't for Latinos participating in coalition in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia many years ago, they would have never had the first Black mayors in those cities, in Harold Washington and David Dinkins and so forth. But there, we have to work at different layers, right, of this. But you can't join a coalition if you don't have some strength that you bring to the coalition, right, and resources that you bring to strengthen the coalition.
Yeah, Victor, you bring a good point. Also, the issue of silence, right, and sometimes it tends to be that groups come in just to have the symbolic picture and the symbolic type of thing, and not really working on the message that people are trying to say, right? And kind of like those assumptions that we have of what moves groups, right? And then you hire a consultant from outside the community and say, this is the message that you need to bring and all those type of things. And anecdotally, I've seen sort of the campaign flyers from election to election, and they're getting better, at least, in that sense, we had ones that were the Google Translate that were like horrible. And now you have, you actually have some people in campaigns that are working on that in terms of that. But it's important, sometimes the message, and kind of like you reacted to what Teresa was saying in terms of that. In sometimes the stereotypes that we have of what moves the vote, right? And that's another interesting conversation in terms of, how do we view that power, and how can we bring that power in terms of that? And that's what causes the rifts between the coalitions, the rifts between groups, and all those type of things, right? And it becomes a challenge, right? And I think even, talking about some of the communities, the historic communities, just because you have the numbers doesn't mean that they're going to survive, right? And we see sort of the decline of kind of like different populations out here, that nothing is kind of like forever if you really doesn't have the right message, if you don't build the capacity, if you don't build the institution and the structures to make sure that your community is successful.
Well, I wanted to say something because being the fact that we're in Orlando and this is Disney's backyard, I wanted to maybe present a different analogy. What about the 7 sleeping dwarfs instead of the sleeping giant? Because, seriously, we are very different. And I wanted to recognize the Venezuelan community and the Colombian community specifically.
Absolutely.
Obviously, all the other Hispanic communities. But here in Orlando, our work to elect Latinos and particularly Puerto Ricans to office has been in large part in coalition with Venezuelan and Colombian community, who serve in many cases as 50% to 60% sometimes of the canvassers that go out and knock and bring people out to vote. And that has to be mentioned. And the thing is that as people know, and people who are part of this Hispanic diaspora or Latino diaspora, in Florida is a very unique and different diaspora than in many of the other states. Here we have a very Caribbean diaspora. Even the Colombian and Venezuelans who are South American do have that contact with the Caribbean Ocean, and that is not toxic, it's endulzador, it's sabroso, It brings that flavor from the Caribbean into those countries as well. And I think that there's that affinity that makes the Latino experience in Florida very different. Obviously, the Cuban community in this state has a humongous impact in how the rest of the people that here in the state relate as Latinos as well. So I think maybe we are one big giant if we were all together. In truth, maybe it's the 7 dwarfs that are sleeping and trying to figure out. There's grumpy, there's happy, we can figure out which one is which. But I think that part of the idea is how do we work together as Latinos to find the commonalities. We all have different histories, different reasons that we're here. But we also have so much commonality that sometimes we focus too much on those things that make us different rather than focusing on those things that make us, one.
Saludos. I just wanted to add, I couldn't help it. I've worked with Marcos Alianza and have also served on various coalitions that you've been a part of. And I just wanted to ask if you could also just speak to your work around coalition building and particularly around different sectors, right? So it's really tempting to fall into the conversation around politics and what are the political implications or even economic implications. What do you think we should be doing to unite, the various sectors and what needs to be done in that respect?
Well, Zoe, thank you for that question, and I think that is one of the crucial things that we try to do differently at the family of organizations that make up Alianza, and that is to really look at the different sectors that make up our community. I think too often, especially national groups come into Florida, or they come into any state, and they quickly contact and get in touch. They're very good, very skilled at getting in touch with the key activists, the key players, the political folks, the people that are connected to the union, connected to X, Y, or Z struggle to get those affinity groups that are gonna basically be able to build a coalition with. However, the community is so much deeper than that, and I think here in Florida there's been real lost opportunities in not building stronger inroads into, for example, faith communities. Oftentimes, faith communities are written off as being conservative and not movable or not interested in politics and so forth and so on. But the truth is that that's where the people are. They're in church. They're thinking about important things, bread and butter issues that affect them and that they need in order to be successful and strive in this new place that they're in. And so I think that that's an area that's often overlooked. And then each party has their sort of their preferred sectors. The Republicans tend to look for, to organize in the business sector. Democrats tend to look to organize in the labor movement and in, progressive organizations. But the idea is to try and be as broad as possible when you build, because that's the only way that you're going to actually be able to overcome those low-hanging fruits, which is the activist. The activist is the low-hanging fruit. And we try to think of ourselves as, if we come up to a mango tree that doesn't have mango bajito, because somebody came before us, then we have to climb the tree and look for the mango que está alto. A lot of people just start looking for another tree. We see a tree that's full of mangoes, but then they're out of reach. Well, let's go reach for them because they're there. And no tan bajito, we have to work for them, but let's work. Let's do that work. And so that's that. I think is an analogy as to how we look at the sectors. And schools is another big sector that I think there is. We don't want to insert politics into education. I think that education should be democratic, and people should be able to pursue and develop their ideas about what kind of world they want to live in. But we have families, we have children, we have teachers, we have people who care a lot about the future in schools. And so how can we not work more in schools? And I think that's also a challenge, in a way, but also a place where we need to make sure that we are engaging and bringing ideas for discussion, new ideas, because life is dynamic, and our presence here in this planet is dynamic. And then lastly, I think there's one topic that to me is it's super important these days, that we need to be talking in everything that we talk to, because we can talk about demographics, we can talk about politics, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about housing, we can talk about any issue. But the fact of what we're putting through this planet in terms of climate change and environmental impact of our practices as human beings on this planet, that is going to make every other argument irrelevant if we don't start doing something about it. So for us at Alianza, that's another very, very important topic that we need to address and we need to bring in, is the issue around the environment, and making sure that we start changing our ways, make sure that we can reverse the trends of global warming that we're currently experiencing.
Thank you, Marco. And I want to acknowledge Gloria Palacio and what she wrote, and hopefully we can get a reaction from the panel. Dr. Rodriguez asked for feedback regarding the data he shared. I personally feel hopeful, but equally frustrated. I feel that no matter how large the Latino population grows in the US, Latinos are not united, and the reigning apathy is discouraging. Maybe it has to do with the fact that we are the same, but so different. We have commonalities, but each Latino is different. Regarding the Latino voter depicted in the cartoon, it seems fairly large, but I think in reality, I don't think it's that large, since those that can vote are few in comparison to the universe of Latino in the US. And I think, Marcos, you mentioned a little bit, but I want to get your reaction, Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Vasquez.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you, Gloria, for sharing, your, giving some of that feedback and sharing your thoughts. I think, I mean, I'm still sort of thinking about the dwarves instead of the giant, which I think is like super interesting to think of. And so I think one of the things in this conversation, though, about unity, because we hear that, I mean, that's like the trope everyone's talking. If only we had unity, right? If only. Part of but that's a kind of like a strange request, right? That we have. I mean, I've said this. I've been frustrated many times, very similarly. you know, like sometimes I can't get agreement in my own like family, you know, like it's like a handful of people. And however, though, we think that some population that the census says is 62 million, we presume that unity is like should be there. And that's part of the source of frustration. How about we assume that unity is we shouldn't, how about if we don't presume unity? How about if we recognize more in the spirit of, I think what Marcos was talking about is a kind of like coalition, like you constantly have to build those bridges, those connections. That's just the name of the game. Then it can be frustrating, but I think that the unity conversation always, not only is it connected to this kind of like demographic thing, like, but it makes us feel like it should be there when it's not. When in fact we should not assume that there would be unity, because as Marcos mentioned, human beings are dynamic and there's differences and there's historical, there's all sorts of factors, cultural, linguistic, that make for complicated, you know, interactions, connections across different populations, groups. Those can be traversed, those can be bridged, but I think, you know, we don't presume unity for other populations either in the same way. You know, that white voters might vote differently. No one ever says like, why aren't they all unified? You know, it's with the Latino population that there's like the constant like, why aren't we unified? Because people are complicated, communities are complicated, and it's going to take political work and organizing and community building, you know, to build provisional forms of unity around specific sorts of issues.
You know, I understand the frustration, because you think about 62 million people, you talk about trying to unite 62 million people. Good luck with that. I mean, that's a whole monstruo. All of my organizing experience, and even running for office, first time in my life, I supported candidates numerous times and been in the trenches and been punched, and I have punched literally on the streets in campaigns. But what I learned was, what I reiterated was what I learned as an organizer, which is, what is the commonality of the people that I'm trying to get to support me? What is it that, you know, what are they concerned about? And that's true in any coalition, in any group of people, and interests change. But that's why I said, you know, the work is very local, and it's trying to figure out what is it that you know, in terms of climate change in my small city, can bring a group of neighbors together to say, you know, we're going to change this practice because this is going to have a positive impact on our environment. And we may disagree on other things, but on this, we're going to agree. And it's always about finding that commonality of folks. You know, I think it's more than 7 dwarfs. It's like 62 million dwarfs, right? That we're looking at it, and it depends on where they are, what is it that you're going to organize around. But I wholeheartedly embrace the frustration that is mentioned here, because I have felt that frustration myself. So I agree with Michael. That's a hell of an expectation, right? That if we do that, we're gonna get, you know, we're gonna find it harder to work.
So we have another question from David Dumke. David, I don't know if you want to ask a question, if you still.
Yeah.
You have me on mute. Oh, there we go. No, I mean, I just kind of made an observation. Maybe if Victor and Michael could comment on that. It's just, and I've joked with you about this a lot, Fernando, the media coverage in the Democratic Party wringing its hands every 2 years after the election, saying, you know, why didn't we do better with Latino voters? When they kind of approach the Latino vote like a monolithic vote, number one. But anyway, I'd like to hear from you, not talk myself. So.
Thank you, David. Yeah.
I could tell you in Miami, I was so mad at folks at our inability to respond to this nonsense of socialism, right? And not that I don't have an interest or see good things in those ideals, but the messaging was so poor that I was frustrated with and the Democrats in particular, to not being able to find an appropriate message to counteract that. I give it to the Republicans. They kicked our butts in that area. They took the percentages that they were looking for. They got them by using that kind of wedge issue against us. And they're, I hear the complaints of the Democrats all the time. And I'm like, dude, you got to stop bringing a knife to a gunfight. You got to do a better job of messaging and knowing who you're talking to. Because that stuff about, dictatorships and socialism and this and that, I've argued with my Cuban friends, my Republican, I have some Republican friends, and I tell them, I said, listen, socialism didn't destroy the democracy in Cuba. You guys destroyed the democracy in Cuba by fighting against the democracy when it was functioning. Every time there was a new Cuban president, the outgoing president was mad and came to Miami to organize against that president. So you guys destroyed that democracy from the inside. And again, these it's blowing in the wind. But anyway, it is about that kind of messaging that doesn't get done, and then they expect the different results, and then they're blaming us for not responding to the message that didn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can add is on the Democratic Party side, at least at the national level or sort of presidential campaigns, right? There's a sense of entitlement to the Latino vote, whatever it is, right? There's a presumption. I mean, part of the reason that the investment in 2016 was so dismal around Latinos nationally, at least from the folks that I was interfacing with and talking to, is the presumption that, of course, Latinos were going to vote against Trump, all of them, and the assumption that the Democratic Party didn't need to make any real investments or inroads or anything, concessions, acknowledgements, because of course they're not going to vote in that direction. And I remember being in Orlando in 2012 and coming into contact with local activists and leaders and folks who were younger folks that were aspiring to run for office, who were Democrats, but they were super frustrated with the Democratic Party of Florida for excluding. So like the party that was excluding on a more regular basis for them at the local level was the Democratic Party, where the Republicans, at least at that time, seemed to be willing to put some figureheads into office to give some like representational stuff. But I mean, I think there's the sense of entitlement, and also the equation, which is like all we need is enough. Both parties operate by all we need is enough Latinos to win an election, and that's as much as that electorate and others matters for the major parties.
If I may jump in, I think it's a really important point to make that despite this claim that it is, I agree with you, David, it's a common narrative that emerges after every cycle here in Florida. But the fact is, if you look at the numbers and you study the numbers, the actual numbers, every cycle there's a growing number and growing percentages of Latinos voting in the state of Florida, in every region of the state of Florida. I think that this last year was a little bit of an outlier, but I think that what we're seeing is that there is a lot of money that runs through politics, billions of dollars every cycle throughout the country, and Florida, and especially in the swing states, it's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that run to basically convince and bring out the vote, and these dollars are not landing in. There's dollars landing in Latino organizations. I will not say that we don't have money in our organization. We do. But nothing. It pales in comparison to monies that come through other organizations. And when you have that situation, it's easy to find a scapegoat and try to blame, why did the election did not work finally? And it's very easy when there's this aspiration on our part, and I think in general, that Latinos are going to somehow one day wake up and vote, and bam, we're gonna have a different result. I think it's short-sighted. Michael, Dr. Rodriguez mentioned several of the opinions in the Washington D.C. Or other power centers, but the fact is that I think what we need to really look at is what is it that is important that we rally around and unite around. I think this more than ever, these last 4 years or the last 5 years have demonstrated that the country, our democracy any democracy is fragile. It's fragile. And if you push it too far, one side to another, you're gonna have breaking points. And I think that we are in a very, very dangerous place right now. And I would venture to say, Venezuela, for example, was one of the strongest democracies in Latin America for years. And almost overnight, or seemingly overnight, it wasn't overnight, but seemingly overnight, through changes in their constitution by parties that dominated their legislative process for a while, they were able to change the makeup and the rules around elections to the point where it's very difficult for the current party to ever lose an election again. And that becomes a dictatorship, and that becomes part of it. And Venezuela is very different from Cuba, and how Cuba went to be, communist regime or socialist regime, however you want to call it. But we all have something, and I don't want to equate Cuba to Venezuela or Venezuela to Puerto Rico, because they're very different, and that's part of the problem. When we come here, we're coming from very different political realities. However, corruption is a serious problem in Venezuela. Corruption is a serious problem in Cuba, and corruption is a serious problem in Puerto Rico. All three, very different, okay? All three suffering from weakening democratic processes. Puerto Rico's in the hand of a fiscal control board, for example. And we look and we point at Venezuela and we point at Cuba, we don't point at Puerto Rico. I think we need to really think about what's going on here in democracies around the world, including our democracy here in the United States, and figure out how we work to defend the democratic process, because we are never going to be in agreement about everything as human beings. But the beautiful thing about democracy, if we can negotiate to the point where we can live together as brothers and sisters, okay, in our society. And I think that is being lost in the current, really got undermined in the last four-year cycle under President Trump, but perhaps continues, because this is now a reaction to that. And so I challenge us to think about it in that way, and to really invest and think about how these narratives, and to question these narratives, because they're not always what they appear to be.
And I just want to add to that. So in various sectors like higher education, right? So we are still kind of celebrating the fact that we became a Hispanic Serving Institute. We got that federal designation as an institution at UCF about 2 or 3 years ago. COVID throws everything off. It's probably 3 years ago now. And we've established the Puerto Rico Research Hub, on the heels of Hurricane Maria. And we've done some amazing things because of Dr. Rivera and some other pioneers on campus. But there's a lot of work to be done, and that's a different space, as is the nonprofit sector, community-based organizations and some others, where we could really, kind of flex our muscle, right? In addition to the political realm. So I just wanted to add that, particularly because we're, at a university setting, and, just encourage us to get involved in Latino student success initiatives and look at, where there are gaps, but also strengths that we could build upon. And that's something that I'm very passionate about. And although I come from the nonprofit sector and I'm used to organizing, I'm really learning how to do that in a higher ed environment. And it's really interesting how important it is to do it on campus and to do it in these kind of sectors in the education realm. So thank you for all of your contributions. Dr. Rivera, I don't know if you have some final words, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Alianza again for making this event possible and for everyone's participation. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Rivera for closing remarks.
Yeah, no, so thank you everybody that attended today. Again, this is going to be available in a recording, but thank you so much. We ran out of time, but great discussion, and make sure to go to our webpage and follow us on social media, and we have other events planned. And thank you so much for a great panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.